welcome to the Brando and Joe podcast. For our first podcast episode, our guest is Jared Weintraub. He's currently working internally at a big consulting firm. He's a board member for Metro. He's researching flow in the workplace, is an adjunct professor at NYU. I think it's safe to say that there's a lot that he has to offer in the field of IO. So, welcome, Jared. It was nice to have you here.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, you guys.
We wanted to talk about maybe your background in IO. What got you into this big field? Like, how did you get started?
So I started with the goal of being a famous musician. That was always my like life goal throughout all of even before elementary school through college and a little bit post grad. So when I decided to go to the University of Delaware, I chose psychology as my major essentially because I knew that psych was sort of a broad area that had a lot of application in the real world as far as like being able to get a job in like a lot of different areas is sort of a I don't want to say generic, but just like kind of more holistic, or there's more options than just like a specific area. So that was why I chose psych in undergrad as my major. I just really also enjoyed it. I had the opportunity to take a few psych courses in high school actually, which was really interesting. Um, but I never really thought that I would go into psych as a profession. Clinical psych just never really appealed to me. To be honest, never wanted to go to grad school or get a PhD. So I thought, oh, I'm not gonna, I'm never gonna do that. It was never my intention. But basically, I pursued music for a few years. I really burnt out on performing. Um, my whole thing with music was that I really felt like I was in the zone while performing and feeling what I later learned was flow. And then when I stopped feeling that, I decided it was time to do something different. So from there, I ended up moving to DC and working for a startup in the education technology space. And at that organization, it was very small. There was about 15 employees, and the founders were really technical founders that had built the product from scratch. And their strength, I guess, was not necessarily like managing the people side of the house. And so after working there for a little while and getting ingrained in the organization, I offered to begin taking over all the HR responsibilities, including like benefits and things like that, as well as trying to improve processes and communications from like the engineering side and the sales and marketing and training side of things. So that's kind of how I got into the HR space. And then basically, as the company did better and better, I thought that they would get bought out, and that if that were the case, I at the time didn't really have the credentials to be doing the work that I was doing. I was sort of learning on the job, and just it was a wonderful experience for me. And I think I did a good job in the role, but from like a background and experience and like academic education perspective, I really shouldn't have been allowed to do a lot of the stuff that I was doing, at least not for like a larger organization. And so I thought I need to get a master's degree to kind of protect myself for the event that we get bought out. And I didn't really want to do an MBA. I just didn't really appeal to me as much. And with the psych background, I started to look into what made sense. I really hadn't heard of IO before, and I ended up just listening to podcasts and trying to understand more about the field. And more, it sounded like exactly the perfect fit for me at the time. Like, how do you grow organizations? How do you make the people that you work with or who work for you be motivated and do high quality work and retain them and recruit people, and working for a startup, all of that was very, very relevant. So I ended up going to get my master's in DC while I was living down there, at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology's Washington DC campus, and that was really my, you know, my first step into the field, along with a few other random things that I won't go into. But yeah, that's how I found IO. It was really a weird journey, and this podcast that I listened to one time from when I was driving from New York to DC. It turned out that the person that was like speaking on the podcast mentioned, "Oh yeah, we just opened this new campus in DC for IO, yeah, for the Chicago school that had an IO program, and it was like a block from the office that I was working at, so it seemed like there was too many weird coincidences happening at once to ignore, and that's where I how I ended up doing my master's in the field.
Wow, that's incredible. When you're talking about that and you were kind of talking about how you started just in that psychology world already, there wasn't really, I'm asking, I guess, was there really any mention of IO when you were doing like your undergrad? Because I know for some of the people that are in our program, they've kind of talked and they either heard about it in one of their like Psych 101 classes early on. And like, was there any mention of that even for you early, or you really first appearance was like when you found it on that podcast?
Yeah, no, I don't think in my undergrad I had any mention of IO. I was interested, like, just the types of psych classes that I was interested were like more like social psych. I took a positive psychology course in undergrad that I loved. I'd been practicing mindfulness, and sort of um, my mindset has always been kind of about like finding the good and like adding positive. Like more, helping people to flourish rather than like fixing something, if that makes sense, which is often the mindset, I guess, for other areas. So no IO, but I think the social and like the positive psych had a lot of influence on why IO was so appealing. But yeah, it was really not until maybe 3 years after undergrad that I had ever really heard of IO at all.
So were your first, I guess, IO classes then in your master's program? Because I know for me, I never took like a organizational class or industrial class or anything like that. Was that
Hmm.
the first time just learning about the topic?
Yeah, I never had. So I have taught now intro to IO at a couple of schools, and there was nothing like that that at least not that I'm aware of. It wasn't an option for me, so I hadn't heard anything about it, and I hadn't taken any courses around IO before that.
Yeah, like I know at my school undergrad, I went to University of Nevada, and
Hmm.
we had one IO course, and it was offered every other summer because they only had like one professor who could teach it.
Hmm.
And of course, like the summer that I was planning on taking it was COVID, so the class ended up getting canceled. Um,
Mm.
but I do know I actually, for a little bit of background, my I started in business school, so I have my degree in management with like
Mm.
minors in psychology and HR. Uh, but we never like they didn't even mention IO really throughout my degree. But what they did have us take for our management major was we had organizational behavior. So we took
Mm.
organizational behavior one and two. So we took it for like a whole year,
Oh
and it
wow,
was kind
okay.
of really where you kind of found that interest. Like a lot of people kind of it piqued their interest and kind of made us more excited for this type of field too. But like that's also over on the West Coast and and I was in Northern Nevada, which is really close to Silicon Valley. So we had a lot of those companies who would move over to Northern Nevada for cheaper land and
Hmm. Hmm.
all of that stuff. But they would hire people out of the school for that type of stuff based off of like some of the classes we were taking. But it's interesting to hear that that was kind of your path to find it and how now it's a little bit more readily available, I would say. Um, and you kind of, I want to backtrack a little bit. You were talking about your music career. Uh,
Yeah.
Give us a little bit of an insight. Just that's really cool that that was kind of the first thing. Like I didn't know that about you. I kind of want to know a little more about it, if you don't mind.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm a singer-songwriter. I mean, I haven't written any music for years now, but that was my thing. I play acoustic guitar, I sing, and yeah, I mean, I started playing open mics and taking Metro North from Westchester, where I'm from, down to Manhattan, I think towards the end of middle school, and playing, yeah, by myself. And I had a relative that lived in Brooklyn. So I would go take the Metro North home to the city, really more in high school. I would go and play open mics at these bars, when I'd have to just say, like, I'm underage, but I won't drink anything, like, just let me perform. And then I would go stay in Brooklyn. I'd take the subway to Brooklyn and stay there because they would go pretty late. And yeah, I would do that almost every Friday, in high school, to try to get better at performing. And then yeah, I kept performing in college, like mostly on campus for all these big groups, and it was pretty cool. Some of the audiences that I performed to were like thousands of people because it was a pretty big school, in like like in the big stadiums and stuff for random events. Um, and Towards the end of when I graduated from college, I ended up being on the Sing Off, the acapella show, that was on
That's so
NBC. If you
cool.
know, yeah, if you know of the Pentatonics, they won the season that I was on. So I
Wow.
was, yeah, so I was on the show with my group from college, the Deltones, and yeah, for me, it was like a sign that everything was going on the right path, and I was going to be famous before I knew it, and that, like, I'd never read my psychology degree in my life. So, you could kind of see where that went. But um, yeah, and then after I was on the sing off, I did pursue music for about 3 years, and performed a lot in New York, in the city, and around the country, a couple of festivals. I recorded an EP, which is like a 5 song album, and then that got on some college radio stations, and there's like a Pandora station, and I'm on Spotify and all of the places, Apple Music, all everywhere. Um, and then yeah, I just kind of burnt out on it after um, about 3 years, something like that. And I did make some progress, but at a certain point I was sort of like, I'm in my mid 20s now. I want to try to get on a track where I can accomplish some of the goals that I want from, like, a personal level, and not live in poverty forever. And yeah, that's kind of the story with the music career.
Well, if you ever want to relight the flame, I played drums in sixth grade.
All
I can
right.
see if I could dig up some of my old music groups.
It comes back
But
quick, I'll
no,
tell
that's
you.
that's really cool. I'll have to learn how to read music again. I don't even know
Yeah.
if I ever did know.
For it's funny, like the purpose of Joe, like Joe and I kind of saw this as kind of something we could give prospective students kind of a listen to, and they could kind of hear some people in the field, their paths, Joe and my paths to like end up in IO. And it's really interesting to hear that you like made a lot of twists and turns before, you know, um, I only took 1 year off before going to graduate school. But the fact is like any of our listeners who are listening and they're trying to figure out what they're doing, nothing needs to be set in stone. Like you can always change your path. And Jared's story right there, like that really gives us like a good example. Like you were like really on that music track and you kept going. And it's awesome to hear that you were like on Pandora and Apple and Spotify and all that stuff. Like that's really cool. I guess like we kind of want to know from you now, like transitioning back into IO, and you went and got your master's. Was there like a thought for you to like go for your PhD? And if not, like what pushed you down that path?
Yeah, so really the sole purpose of the master's for me was applied work, and I ended up, like I said, it was really about the situation I was in at the time, and it ended up being really perfect, and like exciting, because I did have so much autonomy in the role that I was in, that when I started learning about the IO concepts, I would bring them back to the organization, like the next day, essentially, like, oh, I read this in the textbook yesterday, let's try it out, like, build an engagement survey and see where it goes. And then like training and development, I ended up building out, instructional design stuff for the product that we were putting out to train the teachers that we were selling the product to. But yeah, so it was very applied, and I was able to kind of like do all of my essays on, my organization and how things were working out when I would try to apply the things I was learning in class. I never really wanted to do research, but then I read an article about flow and mindfulness and mind wandering, by someone named Scott Dust, who I actually now have published with a couple of times. And he's a great guy. I reached out to him on LinkedIn to tell him I really liked his article, and then we ended up publishing like within 6 months together, which is pretty cool. He was
Wow.
just really nice and receptive. But when I read that article, it clicked for me because um, I understood the difference between these different mental states because I'd been practicing mindfulness for a while. I'd been performing and I played baseball in high school, and like the feeling of flow is really present in all of those domains. And the idea that like in the workplace, that exists and it's actually really prevalent and has a lot of really positive outcomes associated with it. And then also that it was really under examined in the work literature in particular. It was just like, light bulbs pop, just like I was like, oh, this seems like a really good opportunity on all fronts. And then I was also very interested in like the idea of gamification and the idea of like training and helping people to achieve these states. And so that's where like my research has focused on nudging and things like that because of kind of all of those past experiences. Um, and I had no research background and really didn't know how to do that. And so the only way that I saw to like learn those skills was to do the PhD. And so that's how I kind of decided to pursue that. And it was very specific what I wanted to do. And so I really only applied to a few schools, to two schools. And um, with the in my like letters of intent or whatever it's called, the statement of whatever it's called, the essay on the application, I remember just writing all about flow and how like this is the area that I want to focus on, and essentially like don't accept me if this isn't going to be okay for me to study, because a lot of schools, and I was pretty blind in like the schools that I was applying to. A lot of schools, when you apply for their PhD, you're applying like pretty much for an advisor or for like a research track, and there's a little bit less flexibility in like what areas you can pursue. So I wanted to make sure that, if the only reason that I was going to do this was to learn how to research flow, that I was going to be allowed to do that. Um, so yeah, it ended up working out well for me.
Now, this is the research that you're doing with Dr. Nolan, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. So Dr. Nolan has been my champion since day one. It's funny because I describe how I just kind of worked out. But the reality is that one of the big reasons that I applied to Hofstra was there was a researcher, a professor there that had published a little bit on flow and mindfulness and things like that, and so that was a big reason that I applied. But when the year that I got there, that professor had left like that year, and so I thought that I could have fallen into this trap that I just described, which is like now I'm committed to graduate to doing 3+ years of graduate work for something that like I might not even be able to pursue. And so when Dr. Nolan was like kind enough to take me on as his advisee, um, it really was like relief, I guess. And you know when I first proposed it, it's a really weird idea, like this idea of flow and like this mental state, right? That you feel every once in a while, and you know, it's just kind of squishy, I guess. So I think Nolan was a little um, apprehensive about the idea, and so he told me, all right, if you want to study this area, if you're really passionate about it, come back and give me a presentation on like the research that's been done. Essentially, like show me this is real and that there's like actual academic literature that we can work off of, and we'll go from there. And so I still remember like having this presentation with him, and so excited, and I put all this work together, and he was very receptive. He was very happy that I put this together, and I thought he was going to be like, "This sounds great! Like flow is like the most useful thing ever, and like let's do it." But his reaction was essentially like, "Oh well." When you're talking about flow, it's this idea of like being in the zone where you're blocking out distractions and you're really focused and time just like flies by. And some of the descriptions of flow are like, you know, I'm so in the zone that like the kitchen could go on fire and I'd be, I just wouldn't notice it, things like that. Or the house would be on fire and you just kind of like be sitting there still doing what you were doing. And he's like, this doesn't sound like it's like positive all the time. Like, like blocking out distractions. Like if you're a manager and somebody comes to you and needs information to get their job done and you just ignore them, or you don't hear the phone ring, or you know you're in a job where you're in a dangerous situation and not paying attention to your surroundings could hurt somebody. It could be a bad thing. So of course, like I was a little bit like, oh, okay. Well, now I'm going to study the downsides of flow and not like the good things about it, which is really what I want to study. But it ended up to be a really interesting point of view that has really helped us build on our research, and um, it's been a great partnership that I'm really, really grateful for ever since. And we still, I guess 2 years out of the program, almost three, we still talk. At least once a week and are doing a bunch of research together. So uh, definitely worked out for
So
me.
how does one find the bad side effects of flow? Is it how do you survey people? Like how are those results compiled?
Yeah, so I mean, you can. This is actually like the most under researched area is like the downsides or the dark sides of flow. There's very little research on negative side effects, but the research that exists was around like extreme sports and things like that, and also so they found that like people who are doing extreme sports who are in flow will often like take more risks and things like that that in that situation could be literally deadly. And then there was a study done on musicians who practice too much that they hurt themselves. Like they have physical injuries, like to their fingers or to whatever they're using, their shoulders, um, because they get into the zone and they do it for hours and hours and hours without taking breaks and things like that, and it's physically exhausting. So there's some studies around that. Our research has really focused on like perceptions of whether or not flow has been useful or is useful for your job, because of the things that I was describing earlier. That if you're a manager, um, you might not see it as being as useful. So yeah, it's definitely an area that like needs more attention as far as like actual downsides rather than um, just focusing on the positive things. But yeah, you could, to answer your question a little bit more, you could definitely do some surveys and things like that to see and look at maybe performance or potentially like perceptions of teammates, right? To see if when you have some multi-source data and you see that like, I say I'm in flow really frequently and you're someone that works for me and your perceptions of me are more negative, than another leader who maybe says that they experience flow less frequently, and then your perceptions of that leader are more positive. So there's definitely areas to dig deeper into there, um, that maybe Dr. Nolan and I will dig into with some students at some point.
It's a total side point, but the only thing that makes me remind is, have you ever seen the movie? I think it's called Whiplash, where it's about a musician, um, and it's exactly what you're describing. Where I think he gets into like some flow state. There's other things that go on, of
Hmm.
course, but they end up hurting themselves because of the music they're playing.
Or have you
Interesting.
seen the movie Soul?
Oh yeah, yep.
It's like a movie,
Oh, that's even better. Yeah.
and they like talk about people being in the zone,
Hmm.
and then they like go to another place when they're in the zone.
Yeah,
That's like
yeah,
exactly what I'm thinking.
yeah. I love that reference from Soul. But yeah, I mean, it can affect potentially your relationships, right? Like if you're just so invested in something and you're in the zone so frequently that you like just ignore them, I could see how your relationships could suffer from something like that.
And I guess you talked about injuries too. I guess like could that also have an effect on like I guess mental health and things of that nature too? Because I guess that's kind of looped in with injuries. Like is there stuff that's shown on that, like people who are in a flow state having some sort of effect on people like getting chronic migraines or like something like that?
I haven't seen anything like that. I mean, most of the research on mental states and the outcomes is really positive with like reducing stress and increasing engagement and performance and things like that. Um, but yeah, no, I think there are like elements that would be interesting to see, as far as it's an effortful state. That's something that we've kind of we found as well. Like it takes energy to get into flow, right? But the research has shown that flow also creates energy. It's what's called like an upward spiral, where like flow leads to something positive, and then that positive thing leads to more flow, and it's just kind of like positive feedback loop. But I'm sure that there are examples where that would not apply, and there could be some negative effects too.
I'm intrigued on this research specifically because I know like you kind of leaned on your music and your baseball background. Like
Hmm.
I talk about it a lot, but my experience partially with IO and just working in general is I'm a tennis coach. Like I played tennis my whole life,
Hmm.
uh, and definitely have experienced flow. And I have a feeling that you probably have multiple times, like whether it was music related or sports related. Do you kind of see that playing a part or like playing a role in this research moving forward too? So like when you go back, like is this even pushing you forward like musically, like you're going to go back into music and looking at it like that to try and study this a little bit more and see how it affects you personally?
Um, I mean, I would love to do a little bit more like I've definitely, I guess, fantasized about some music research and how that would even like the idea of group flow and this idea that like people can feel flow together is another really understudied area. And from my experience playing on sports teams and especially in bands and my like a cappella group, that feeling of like just like getting into flow together is really amazing and like different than flow alone. Um, and I'd be really interested to see if being in flow as a group results in like higher quality, um, music or performances, right? Looking at like maybe audience ratings, right, for the quality of performances or things like that. Um, so it doesn't. I mean, it definitely informs a lot of my work too. Like the research informs practice. The coaching that I've done is rooted in flow theory and like the core tenets of like how people get into flow. And then for my own just like general productivity, I try to use the research um, that I've read and that I've conducted to try to help myself to get into flow more often at work to be more productive and really reap the benefits of being in the zone, while also like balancing, like we're saying, just like trying to be in flow all day and also taking breaks and saving having some time during the day for recovery and just like energy, um, just like recharge, right? Because a lot of the clients that I've had for the coaching side of things, they feel burnout, right? And they feel like they need to be productive every minute of every day, and that's like what flow is. And the reality is that that isn't the case, and that as a goal definitely can lead to burnout, and that taking breaks, making sure that you're like taking care of yourself mentally and physically helps you to recharge and to then be able to focus your energy on being productive and also be getting into flow. So that balance is really important and often not considered, because I think a lot of people also just feel like they need more flow, and that is often the case, but it is sometimes to get more flow, you have to like take a step back and um, like restructure the way that you're doing your work to be healthier and more conducive to sustainable flow.
So I'm just wondering too with that, like when you talk about flow and what about, have you looked at anything in regards to like ADD and ADHD and how that can like change or affect people's flow states and if they're more common or less common based off that?
I actually haven't seen research on that before, but I have gotten this question a bunch of times because it makes sense to me. Um, so no is the answer, but I do think that it would be really interesting to dig into for sure.
Does your research mainly focus just of the flow state, or have you guys looked at like any like possible like variables of how people get into flow, or like the antecedents of getting into flow, or things like of that nature?
Yeah, yeah. So most of the research that we've done focuses on the whole process of like the antecedents, flow itself, and then the outcomes. So we really try to see the whole picture, or a good slice of the picture at least. So Nolan and I's research has looked at like grit as one of the antecedents to flow, mindfulness as an antecedent to flow, and then this idea of flow metacognition, and really so far, which is focused on like usefulness beliefs about flow at work. And we found that like the more useful that you think flow is, the more often that you're going to experience it. And the more grit that you have, the more likely you'll experience flow. And same with like mindfulness, right? In the research that we've done has really been shown to be a nice predictor of flow. And then the outcomes of interest that I've really focused on are engagement, performance, and stress, different kinds of stress. Um, so yeah, that whole picture. But I have some unpublished stuff that I've worked on with David Cassell, who is also a Hofstra grad. We are still writing up the manuscript and getting it under review, but we asked some open-ended questions around like what people can do to get into flow, and some of the things that they can do to maintain it. So really looking at those strategies for achieving the state, which is actually pretty understudied still in the workplace as well.
I find that they measure the outcomes too, because I feel like there's been times when I've been in this flow state, and sometimes I look at my work and I was like, "What did I just write?" Like, even though I
Yeah,
felt like I was in the zone, but and then I look
yeah.
at the product and I was like, "This doesn't make any sense." But then there have been other times where I mean, you can get, say, you're writing an essay and you get so much done, and you're like, "Wow, this is great."
hmm
Do you find that in your research that someone could be in the flow state, but technically maybe it's just like they're just working hard, but the actual product isn't coming out as great as they thought it would be?
So I think it's one of those downsides that's understudied, right? And that is another thing that no one actually brought up in that initial conversation, which is like if you get stuck on the wrong thing, right, and you're down that rabbit hole, and time is just flying by, and you look up and like you wasted all your time on something you shouldn't have been doing, right, or not wasn't the biggest priority, that's not great either. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think think there's a lot of areas like that to dig into and explore a little bit more.
So I guess I just kind of want to ask too about, like, we're talking about all of this research and everything you're doing to get that PhD. Obviously, we mentioned that you are teaching. Was that in that thought process when you went for that PhD? Did you think that being like an adjunct professor or doing anything in the teaching realm was something that you wanted to do? And then, like, how did you end up there? And kind of just give us an idea and give our listeners an idea of who are like maybe thinking of the same path.
Yeah, so I mean, I've always enjoyed kind of being a mentor and like helping people and like sharing my knowledge with people. But I never really thought that I was a camp counselor, like things like that, which is kind of, it's a little bit similar actually, the experience, like in the relationships that you end up having with students and things like that. But yeah, I never really thought of there wasn't a vision for me to like be a professor and to teach. But once I got into the PhD program and I was really interested in the research side and potentially considering an academic career, um, I wanted to try it and I wanted to see what it was like. And I also kind of recognized that this is pretty much the only path to being able to do this. Like you need a PhD most of the time, depending on the field, to teach at the university level, right? And I didn't want to just like let that opportunity go. So I figured, why not try it? And then when I did, I really, really enjoyed it, and I really loved the back and forth with students, and like I learned from them, and they learned from me, which is exciting, and I could see progress, and from the questions that people would ask and the feedback that I would get, um, it was really rewarding to see growth throughout the semester and beyond. At this point, I've had a lot of students ask for letters of recommendation, and then they've gotten accepted to master's programs and PhD programs, and are in the field at this point doing cool stuff. So that's really rewarding to see. And then yeah, once I did it, I loved it. It's every class is really different. Every like subject that I've taught is different. Um, so it's always kind of an adventure and keeps me connected to students, and also like every semester when I kind of like go back and look at the syllabus and y- reread the things that I'm going to be teaching about, it reminds you of things, and it also um, there's a lot of, I mean, I just think IO has a lot to offer for professionals in practice. And so reading this textbooks and articles, which I probably wouldn't have been doing if I decided not to teach, keeps me like rooted in that stuff and helps me inform my practice. And so it's just like a really nice symbiotic relationship. But yeah, no, it was never my intention to be a professor, and now it's just a nice like fun thing that I get to do.
That's so awesome. And I'm sure it's super rewarding. I know as a tennis coach, just every time you feel like you're making an impact, and I'm just doing it in like a athletic way, but like when, in an educational way, that has to be super rewarding.
Yeah.
Joe and I spend a lot of time where we like talk about networking and building a network, especially here in New York. Like for you, with becoming a professor and doing that at multiple schools, by the way, doing it
hmm
at different schools, like has that been something that's kind of helped your network and kind of helped you out professionally as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is really helpful in my network and just like my student network, right? Just like knowing young people who are in the field and who are interested in a lot of different things and bring innovative ideas to the classroom and end up doing interesting things with their careers, and reconnecting with them at things like STIOP or Metro or things like that has been really like exciting to see. And um, so yes, like in a sense, definitely it has increased my network, and from a professional standpoint, it is like a nice really the teaching is just a fun, exciting thing for me to do, but it is a nice thing for me to have on my resume for this type of stuff that I do. But that's definitely not the like underlying motivation for why I've been doing it. Yeah.
Of course.
I know we're getting close to running out of time, but I saw that you brought up Metro. Is something you could just talk a little about and just describe briefly, like what Metro is? I believe you're the vice president, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's the New York Metropolitan Association of Applied Psychology. So rather than saying that big name, we just call it Metro. So I am the vice president, and without Metro, I never would have found Hofstra probably. So I moved back to New York after I finished my master's degree and was working for an ed tech startup, and really didn't have, I just earned this master's degree in IO, and the company that I worked for had no other IOs in it. I didn't know anybody else in the field. And in DC, I really learned the value of networking and being part of kind of like networking organizations. And so I did a search online to see like what are some of the IO like networking groups in New York City, and I found Metro, which is over I think 125 years old, which is pretty wild. Um,
Wow.
and I
Didn't know
started
that.
going to yeah, and I started going to um, the meetings and started making friends with students and people who had just graduated, um, and really loved the community. And the speakers were super interesting. And there was a big Hofstra alum and student like showing, or just like there was a lot of people that would show up from Hofstra, and that's where I really learned about the program and what it was all about. And so when I started to seriously consider doing a PhD, that's what led me to Hofstra. But in general, Metro is this awesome organization. We have a monthly speaker series where we have influential people in the field from all different walks of life and who do lots of different things, um, who come and speak to the community once a month. We also do Career Day. We have a bunch of educational um, offerings as well. We did like an R workshop last year and the coaching workshop this year. And it's just generally a nice community, like a really wonderful community that um, you know is fun to be a part of, and also great for networking. We have a career day as well. um, and I've made a lot of close friends from just being in Metro. So when I graduated from Hofstra, I ran for the board position. The way that it works is you run for secretary, and then you become, it's like a 4-year commitment. You become it's secretary, treasurer, vice president, president. This is my 3rd year, so I'm the vice president. So next year I'll be president. Um, and it's been a
Oh,
great journey. I did career day. I was a career day chair for 2 years before that. So it really had a at this point pretty long tenure there. Although my tenure is nothing compared to some of the members who have have been members for probably 30, 40 years at this point. Um, but yeah, it's a great community. I definitely recommend checking it out and coming to Career Day, coming to our speaker series, and all of the things, becoming a member.
Awesome getting to see you there. Like we got to catch up for a split second because we didn't have too much time to all talk afterwards. But I, it's cool that like you've been experiencing that for so long, and like now you're a Hofstra alum and we're Hofstra students going and getting to see you there. Like the Joe and I have been talking about planning for that next Metro event in February already. So
Hmm.
it's definitely like always something we're marking our calendars for.
Yeah, it's fun, and you see professors at, like in a different context a lot of times, right? It's kind of a fun experience to do that. And then when you graduate, like it's nice. Like Nick Salter was at the last meeting, and I would otherwise not really have a chance to see people like him like very often, because just our paths don't usually cross. But it's a great example of being able to stay in touch with people and hear what they're doing, and you never know what kind of opportunities it brings up to. I've definitely had a bunch of career opportunities pop up in actually teaching and my other work directly from Metro. So it's had tons and tons of benefits for me. Um, so that's why I love to give back like I do to the organization.
Yeah. It's cool to see professionals in like an applied setting too, because I know we learn about all this stuff in our program, but we don't get to like meet a lot of people, whether it's at these networking events. So I highly suggest whoever's listening to go ahead and try out Metro and SIOP and whatever else you could find.
It is true. I mean, we have
100%.
a wide variety of speakers, but just besides the speakers, the members themselves are, like I said before, doing tons of different things. So as a student, even like in my kind of like gap years between my master's and the PhD, just seeing what people can do with their degrees and with this type of background was really inspiring. And yeah, I mean, I I have people who I can call for advice from Metro for like random things, when situations come up that I wouldn't be able to have if it weren't for Metro for sure.
That's so cool. No, we don't want to take up too much of your time. We definitely like wanted to give you a chance just at the end, real quick, to kind of just give you the floor and talk about like anything you're currently excited on that you're working on, or anything you're excited about, research or work wise, that you just like. The floor is yours, really.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Yeah, I would say first, thank you for having me. This has been great. It's a fun conversation. And yeah, I mean, I'm really excited. I'm doing research with Dr. Nolan right now. That's we're just wrapping up data collection, and it's pretty innovative stuff. So I don't want to blow the lead on that one yet, but it's going to be pretty cool once we do the analyses and hopefully get that published soon. But that's super exciting. The Metro stuff that we talked about is also really really exciting and big focus of mine right now. Obviously, as the vice president going to the year of becoming president and thinking about the types of speakers that interested in bringing in for next year's speaker series. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think the most of the situations that I've gotten in and like where I am now are because I wasn't afraid to like reach out to people and ask them for advice or to ask for their insights or just about their backgrounds. And um, my advice, I think, is just to try to step out of your comfort zone and feel comfortable reaching out to people that you are interested in, like how they got to where they are, or interested in getting involved with work that they're doing. Because for the most part, when you reach out to people, you have very little to lose, right? And like the worst that's going to happen is they ignore you or they say, get a life and don't bother me again, which literally has never happened to me before. But I guess for the worst case scenario, that's it. Um, and the vast majority of the time, people respond. They're willing to get on a 30-minute call with you to talk about whatever you're interested in. And those conversations for me have led to publishing, have led to adjunct positions at schools that I really was interested in getting involved with, coaching, things like that. So that, and once you start, right, once you kind of get comfortable just like reaching out to people, um, it becomes a lot easier, especially after you start to get some positive results and also realize that the downside is like pretty minimal as far as like just reaching out, like I just said. So that's my biggest advice, I think, to students and just really anybody looking to learn more, to advance their careers. Learning from others is has been super important to me, and it's not always easy to do that, but it's a good muscle to start developing, especially as a student. It's always a good excuse, a good title to throw around, like, hey, I'm so and so, I'm a student at so and so school, and I'm interested in learning about what you're doing, or the work that you're doing looks super interesting to me. People like to talk about themselves and the work that they're doing, especially when they feel like they're, mentoring somebody.
That's
That's so
great.
awesome. Yeah, I think people will definitely appreciate that advice. And like, just again, we want to thank you so much for your time. And like, we don't want to take up too much of it, but it was so awesome getting to hear about all that stuff that you've done. I'm sure our listeners are going to be super excited to hear your path and everything you've done in your life. And we just appreciate you again for your time, Jared. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jared.
Absolutely.
We'll see
Thank
you
you
at
both.
Metro.
Yeah, absolutely. See you there. Thank you. Anytime.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Wow, so that was awesome having Jared on here. I know you and I have gotten the chance to meet him in person a few times now, but it's just always cool to catch up. Uh, you know,
Yeah. No, it
learned a
was
lot
cool.
about him today. I didn't know all that. Did you? Like, I didn't know he had a music background like that.
No, I didn't really know anything about his background. It was the first I've really heard about how he came to like IO. But it was interesting to learn more about flow because I know for those who know, Dr. Nolan was one of our professors at Hofstra in the program, and they briefly brought up flow. Like I heard that they were researching it, but we never like went into depth. So it's kind of just cool to see like what they're actually studying, like what the research is about in whole. Um, and then I also like about the how he brought up Metro. I highly think that everyone should go to Metro, or even if you can't go to Metro or SAP, any of those conventions have been helpful for both Brandon and I.
100%. Joe and I, like, as you guys like hear from us, him and I are always talking about networking. We think it's really something that's super important as students trying to enter the field and working professionals. Just it's also about who you know and what you do.
Of course.
Joe and I have had the luxury of getting to go to these Metro events, and I would say that every single time it's been a net positive situation, wouldn't you?
Yeah, there's nothing bad that will ever come from the events. And 99% of the time, you meet other people, and it ends up being a good thing.
Yeah.
It's always, and it's also fun. You could just get to hear about what the current research in the field is. The talks are always cool. I think the one coming up is storytelling, something about data and storytelling, right?
Yeah, and but it was cool. Like Jared said, like his one thing of advice, like just taking those risks and stuff and putting yourself out there. Like it's super true, and like we can attest to that as stuff that we've been doing and working together throughout the last 6 months. Really has been us doing that, right, Joe?
Yeah, it still feels kind of new. I bet a lot of people feel like that coming from a psych background where I'd never really had to like network or do what I'm doing now in my undergrad. But no, it's going well.
Yeah, and for our listeners too, like Joe has that psych background, and I have like a business psych background. And I will say, if you are trying to figure out what to take and what you should be learning, I could attest to that business background being super beneficial. I had I had to go to networking events. I had to work organizational development. I had to learn about culture while also doing all like the necessary psychology things. So it's almost like a creation of an IO degree because a lot of schools don't have that for undergrad, as Joe can also attest to. But we just wanted to thank you guys for listening. This is our first official one, and we're excited to have you guys on every Friday. So keep a lookout for our notifications and look at Jared's LinkedIn in the bio. Thank you guys so much.
Thanks, guys.